We come back to Newsline with in-depth discussion on Vietnam's economic prospect, which appears optimistic despite turbulence. Khai Minh has more.
Now, Tam Chang, the positive outlook you just mentioned is based on analysis presented by experts at the Doubling Down on Vietnam Next Decade of Growth webinar held on Tuesday. The webinar was co-organized by EuroCham, BritCham, Decision Lab and Dragon Capital. At the webinar, experts affirmed that uncertainties persist, including the reciprocal tariffs. However, Vietnam's recent mergers, along with positive legal reforms, private sector promotion and infrastructure development, have been contributing to the country's positive economic outlook. In addition, domestic consumer confidence in Vietnam's market and GDP growth remain stable, making consumption a continuous growth driver. European investors also continue to see Vietnam as a destination for their business. Now, the outlook is expected to be positive both in the short term and the next decade of growth. So what needs to be watched out for and what can be done to ensure Vietnam's development in the new phase? We connect with Mr. Thuê Quist Thomason, CEO Decision Lab, and Mr. Will Ross, Chief Marketing Officer of Dragon Capital, to get further insights. Now, thank you both for joining us today. Now, as the Federal Reserve or Fed has cut interest rates for the first time this year and more reductions are expected to be made, how will this impact Vietnam's economic growth driver this year? Will, your thoughts?
Cutting rates is clearly it's a good thing on multiple levels. One, it buoys confidence globally. In terms of overall confidence, if we look at we take the performance of the VNI over 2022, we found that for most of the year it tracked as it began to sell off from the high, it tracked the movements in the Fed as the Fed raised rates and reduced risk appetite globally. So the beginning of a risk reduction in rates helps risk appetite globally as well as locally. Lower US rates probably further weakens the US dollar. And historically, in periods of time where the dollar has weakened, that's when emerging markets have tended to outperform, both in terms of financial assets as well as economically. And that bodes well for Vietnam.
Now, Thuê, you pointed out that despite stable confidence, Vietnamese consumers' habits are still changing. How should businesses change their business and manufacturing strategies in order to make consumption a true driver of Vietnamese economic growth?
Yes, so I think for domestic companies, they really need to see their customers, their consumers as partners on this journey, because new and exciting doesn't do it anymore. You really need to deliver value. When we increase overall GDP in Vietnam, we have a huge amount of consumers that are moving into the middle class, and this basically opens up quite a lot of new business opportunities. And you will see things, I mentioned education before, also healthcare, insurance, traveling, a lot of new winners that basically can cater to the consumers of tomorrow. A lot of companies in Vietnam have been focusing on the young generation, but we are getting an aging population, and the older the consumers are, the more they have available to spend. So really look at pockets of growth across the population and not just amongst the youngest.
Now, a question for both of our guests. What external factors should Vietnam take a closer look at till the end of this year? And in the long run, what needs to be prioritized for the next chapter of growth to achieve a higher middle income and later high income status?
It comes down to where you're going to be creating value in the economy. I think Vietnam needs, should, could, can invest more to elevate the status of Vietnamese products globally, because I think that's how we begin to capture those increments that we are able to sell products at a higher price point, because there's a belief in the conviction of a Vietnamese good, whether a digital good or a physical good, whether clothing, whether a service, is something that's worth paying for at a higher price.
I think sometimes in Vietnam we need to consider what are the areas we can actually affect. And I think if you look across government policy on foreign investments, it is very centered around FDI inflow, and with good reason. A lot of the export from Vietnam is produced and is generated by foreign invested companies here, right? So we need diversification in terms of the investments into Vietnam, and then we need to focus on quality. We need to focus on companies that will upskill people in Vietnam, that will create meaningful jobs for the future, and this is going to be very, very important because it matters what kind of jobs are created in Vietnam if we want families to get better off in the future.
Now, thank you both for your valuable insights.